Imagine a winter town under heavy snow where one father felt a chill in his heart before the storm even arrived. A quiet boy sat alone in a cold kitchen, and a loyal German shepherd refused to rest because he sensed something was terribly wrong. Would you trust the weather forecast or the instinct of a dog who loves his family more than warmth or sleep? Before we begin this true winter story of courage and rescue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and how cold it gets in your town during winter. And if you love stories of faith, loyalty, and miracles, please press subscribe to support the channel so we can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories. Winter came down over Winter Creek like a quiet, pale spell, softening every sharp edge of the little town until even yesterday's worries seemed buried under snow. The houses along the narrow streets wore thick white caps, chimneys breathing out lazy ribbons of smoke that drifted into a sky the color of old tin. The small river that cut through the town, usually restless and bright, now slept under a fragile skin of ice that cracked and chimed when the wind pressed too hard. Weather reports on crackling radios and worn-out TV sets had repeated the same warning for days. A heavy snowstorm would roll in by the end of the week, thicker and more stubborn than usual, the kind of storm that swallowed roads, silenced engines, and made even the bravest drivers think twice. But for now, early in the morning, Winter Creek was still, holding its breath. In a modest house perched on a gentle slope at the edge of town, Rowan Hale stood in the narrow hallway, buttoning his winter duty jacket with the patience of a man who had done this ritual thousands of times but never once considered it routine. Rowan was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from years of real work rather than any gym. His hair, once a dark brown, now held a few threads of gray at the temples, like frost edging a roof. His face was clean-shaven, but carried faint lines around the eyes and mouth, the quiet proof of long shifts, late calls, and all the unsaid things that had to be swallowed in a small-town officer's life. There was a steadiness in him, a calm that people instinctively trusted. Yet this morning, that calm felt like ice over deep, moving water. As he checked the weight of his radio on his belt, tapped the holster at his hip to be sure the latch was secure, and slid a thin folder of case notes into his bag, there was a flicker in his chest that refused to settle. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a shadow passing over the snow. He had been assigned to a special task force in the neighboring county. 5 days, not 2 long weeks, like some of the bigger city officers faced, but long enough to feel the shape of absence in a house. Communication would still be possible, the supervisor had said. There would be cell service most of the time, only a few stretches of highway and forest, where the signal dropped into nothing. "You'll be fine," they had told him. "It's just 5 days. Just 5 days," he repeated in his mind, as if the words were a charm. In the living room, where the big front window framed a view of the snow-covered yard and the sleepy street below, Micah sat curled up on the wide wooden sill, small hands wrapped around a steaming mug of cocoa. At 10 years old, Micah was at that in-between age where his limbs were starting to lengthen, but his shoulders still curved inward as if he were guarding something delicate inside his chest. He had pale skin that flushed easily in the cold, a scatter of light freckles across his nose, and a mop of brown hair that always seemed one day overdue for a trim. His eyes, a soft gray like the sky outside, were usually full of quiet curiosity, but this morning they were darker, heavy with something he didn't yet know how to name. Micah was a gentle boy, the kind that apologized when he bumped into furniture, the kind that listened more than he talked, storing other people's moods inside himself like fragile glass bottles he was afraid to drop. The mug warmed his fingers, but it didn't touch the cold knot in his stomach as he watched his father move around the house, checking and rechecking everything for the trip. Outside, the street lamps still glowed faintly, halos of light caught in drifting snowflakes. The world looked beautiful, but to Micah, it felt like the kind of beauty that stood very far away from him. In the doorway that opened onto the short back porch, Bron stood like a carved statue brought to life. Bron was a 5-year-old German shepherd, large and powerful, with a deep chest, strong legs, and a coat of black and tan that looked almost gold where the light touched it. A faint notch on one ear and a pale scar near his shoulder hinted at a working past that had not always been peaceful. His dark eyes were sharp and intelligent, and there was an alertness in the way he held himself that never quite relaxed, as if he were always listening to a second world just beyond human hearing. Bron was a trained K-9, partnered with Rowan on patrol, and in the time since he had been assigned to the Hale family, he had settled into the dual role of officer and guardian in the only way a good dog knows how, with absolute loyalty. Usually, when Rowan prepared to leave for a shift, Bron obeyed every command as if the words were stones in the foundation of his life. A gesture, a nod, a single syllable, and he would trot to the back of the patrol SUV, leap in, and circle once before, lying down, ready. But not this morning. This morning, when Alara stepped out onto the porch, the soft click of her boots on the wooden boards barely audible through the quiet, Bron moved forward until his body blocked the top of the steps. His muscles tightened under his coat, and his tail, usually relaxed and steady, hung low and still. He stared at Alara with an intensity that could have been mistaken for curiosity, if not for the almost inaudible growl that hummed in his chest, like distant thunder under snow. Alara Prescott, 35, stood in the doorway with a robe tied neatly at the waist and a wool scarf thrown over her shoulders. She was neither too tall nor too short, with a slender frame that suggested someone careful about how she appeared in public. Her dark brown hair fell in waves to her shoulders, framing a face that seemed made for soft smiles and sympathetic nods. To a stranger, she would look like the sort of woman you'd trust to organize a charity bake sale, or to sit beside a hospital bed with a gentle touch and a quietly encouraging voice. Around town, people often said she had the right kind of face to be a mother. Open, warm, dependable. With neighbors, she was polite and composed. With Rowan, she was attentive in all the ways that looked good from the outside. If there was something colder in her gaze when no one else was looking, only a very few might have noticed, and most of them wouldn't have believed it anyway. Right now, as she looked past Bron toward Rowan, her lips curved into that practiced, tender smile that had soothed more than one of Rowan's late-night worries in the past year. But Bron's eyes did not trust the smile. He shifted his weight forward, shoulders slightly lowered, his body forming a quiet barrier between her and the path down to the yard that led to the street that led to every place a boy might run to if he were frightened. "Easy, Bron," Rowan called, his tone more puzzled than stern. The dog cast a brief look over his shoulder, ears flicking at the familiar voice, then returned his gaze to Alara. The growl faded into silence, but he did not step aside. Rowan hesitated as he came closer, the crunch of his boots on the packed snow sounding louder in the morning hush. The cold air bit at his cheeks, and he felt that strange pulling weight in his chest again, a sense that something invisible in the house was rearranging itself this very moment, like furniture scraping across a floor in the dark. Ilara let out a small, amused breath, as if brushing off a child's stubbornness. "He's just wound up because he feels the storm coming," she said lightly. Her voice was smooth, a warm contralto that always seemed to know how to land on the right note. She took a single step closer, careful, not challenging the dog's space, and then glanced past him into the house. "Micah, honey, come say goodbye properly. Your dad's going to be away for a few days." Micah slipped down from the window seat, his socked feet nearly silent on the wooden floor. He wore a thick navy sweater that was just a little too long in the sleeves and faded flannel pajama pants tucked into wool socks, his usual winter morning armor. As he approached the doorway, he instinctively stayed on the side of the frame, closer to Bron, the dog's familiar smell of fur and snow and faint leather filling his nose, grounding him. Rowan watched his son step out onto the threshold, a small figure outlined against the pale light. There was something about the way Micah's shoulders hunched inward that tugged at him. He set his bag down, reached out, and pulled the boy into a hug. Micah pressed his face into the rough fabric of Rowan's jacket, breathing in the mix of cold air and the faint sense of coffee, metal, and brawn that always clung to his father's clothes. "It's just 5 days," Rowan murmured, his voice low. "I'll call every night if the signal's good. You'll be okay." Micah nodded against his chest, not trusting his voice. He wanted to say that the storm frightened him, not the one on the Weather Channel, but the one he felt in the house whenever doors closed and footsteps sounded a certain way on the stairs. But the words tangled on his tongue. He had learned over the years that sometimes silence kept the peace better than the truth did. Ilara stepped closer then, her hand coming to rest lightly on Micah's shoulder. Her fingers were slender, nails neatly trimmed, and painted a neutral shade. "We'll be fine, Rowan," she said, and her tone was the very definition of a proper mother's voice. Gentle, reassuring, with just enough firmness to sound responsible. "I'll make sure he eats well, stays warm, and if the roads aren't too bad, I'll drive him to school. If it gets worse, I'll call the school and let them know. And we'll update you every evening, won't we, Micah?" She tilted her head, looking down at the boy with a practiced softness. Micah forced himself to meet her eyes. Under the pale brown irises, he sometimes caught something flat and calculating, like ice under thin snow. But now, all he could do was nod. He didn't want to cause trouble. He didn't want to give anyone a reason to sound disappointed in him. Bron shifted again, the leather of his collar creaking softly. His gaze moved from Alara's hand on Micah's shoulder to Rowan's face, then back again, as if he were trying to warn them in a language they had all forgotten how to hear. Rowan's unease sharpened, a brief flash like lightning behind closed eyes. Little things crowded his mind without being invited. The way Alara sometimes held Micah's chin too tightly when telling him to pay attention. The rare but unmistakable flinch in the boy's posture when her voice dipped into a lower register. The too sweet way she spoke about order and discipline when she thought he wasn't really listening. And yet, she had never crossed a line he could clearly draw in the snow. Not one he could point at and say, "There, that is wrong." So his doubts stayed where they always did, in the quieter rooms of his mind, locked behind the door called, "Maybe I'm just too protective." He picked up his bag again, not trusting himself to linger. "All right," he said, more to settle himself than anything else. "You know where the emergency contacts are, the neighbors, the station, the clinic. Roads might get tricky once the storm hits, so if anything feels off, you call early, don't wait." "Of course," Alara replied, nodding with that perfectly measured concern. "We'll be careful." Rowan whistled softly, and Bron finally tore his gaze away from the porch. With visible reluctance, the big dog stepped aside, trotting down the steps and across the snow-dusted path to the waiting patrol SUV. He paused once at the open hatch, looking back over his shoulder toward Micah and Alara. A soft whine slipped out, tremulous and low, the sound of a guardian being pulled away from the post he didn't want to abandon. Micah lifted a hand and gave a small wave, the movement slow, almost hesitant. "See you soon, boy," he whispered, breath smoking in the cold air. "Keep Dad safe." Bron's ears twitched at the words, and then he gathered himself and leaped into the back of the vehicle. Rowan closed the hatch gently, as if not to startle someone in a sick room, then walked around to the driver's seat. As he opened the door, a gust of wind sent a spray of loose snow skittering across the yard, swirling around his boots and the bottom of his coat like a fleeting warning. He glanced up at the sky one last time. The clouds were thickening, the light shifting toward that particular dimness that always came before a storm. His heart tightened with a wordless premonition, and for a heartbeat he nearly turned back, nearly called out to Micah again, nearly told the supervisor he would need another day. But then he saw Alara's soft smile, heard her say, "Go on, Rowan, we'll be all right," and saw Micah standing beside her, small and silent, not protesting, not reaching out as he might have when he was younger. The moment passed like breath on a window, leaving only the trace of its shape behind. Just 5 days, he reminded himself as he climbed into the car and started the engine. The patrol SUV rolled down the snowy slope, tires crunching and slipping slightly before finding grip. In the back, Bron stood for as long as he could, braced against the movement, his head turned to keep the house in sight. Only when the vehicle reached the bend in the road and the little home on the hill disappeared behind a row of snow-laden pines did the dog slowly lower himself into a lying position. For a few minutes, he remained tense, ears pricked, as if he could still hear something calling to him from far behind. Then, with a reluctant sigh that only Rowan noticed in the rearview mirror, he rested his head on his paws. The town of Winter Creek slipped past, small and quiet. The shops still dark, the streets nearly empty. It looked like a peaceful painting pinned under glass. But somewhere between the steady beat of the windshield wipers and the faint hum of the heater, Rowan felt a dissonant note inside him, like a string tuned just a little too tight. He told himself that it was just the storm, just the distance, just the fact that leaving family, no matter how briefly, never sat comfortably in a father's heart. Behind him, on the hill, the house door closed with a soft click that no one in the car could hear. The snow kept falling, gentle and constant, as if it were already busy hiding whatever was about to happen next. When Rowan's patrol SUV finally disappeared behind the curtain of pines at the bottom of the hill, the quiet outside the house seemed to thicken. Snow continued its silent descent, coating old footprints, smoothing edges, erasing signs of movement, as if nature itself were conspiring to hide what would soon unfold. Inside, the moment the last echo of the engine faded, the air changed. Micah didn't hear the change. He felt it. It arrived in the silence. Ilara stood just inside the threshold, hands still resting on the doorknob. She did not wave. She did not sigh. She simply listened, as if timing something. Then, in one sharp motion, she turned the deadbolt and the lock clicked with a cold, final sound. Micah looked up at her. He had heard that sound before, the sound of doors being closed not just for warmth, but for control. Ilara stepped forward, and the softness she wore, the pleasant smile, the warm tone, dropped away like a shawl shrugged from the shoulders. It wasn't dramatic, not like a villain in a play revealing themselves with thunder. It was frightening precisely because it was quiet, clinical, like a nurse folding away her bedside manners and revealing the steel. "Take off your coat," she said. Her voice had changed, lower, flatter, edged with frost. Micah blinked. "But it's cold." I said, "Take it off." The coat came off. She pointed not to the living room, not to the sofa, not to the fireplace where heat flickered, but to the kitchen. The kitchen was the coldest room in the house. The heater there was weak, the windows drafty, and the floor unforgivingly cold tile. Micah moved slowly toward the far corner, the same corner he'd been sent to on past occasions, for being forgetful, for being messy, for talking back, or for any infraction Ilara judged necessary. Today she didn't even name the offense. There was no justification, no explanation, no stated reason. That made it worse. He sat on the wooden stool in the corner, sleeves pulled over his hands, shoulders tight to retain warmth. The chill from the floor seemed to travel up through his socks and into his bones. Ilara crossed the kitchen, picking up her phone. Micah kept still, watching her back as she dialed the school's number. He could hear the teacher's voice at the other end, faint, bright, unaware. "Yes," Ilara said, slipping easily into her syrup-sweet tone again. "Micah won't be in for the next few days. He's down with a winter flu, poor thing. High fever. Doctor says rest is best. And with the storm coming, well, safety first." She gave a soft, sympathetic laugh, as though the image of a ghost-pale, bedridden child was almost endearing. Micah sat very still. His body didn't shake with fever. It shook with cold. Ilara hung up. The sweetness evaporated from her like mist. She didn't look at him as she spoke. "You'll eat less for a few days. I don't want. You sick from too much sugar or salt. I'm responsible for your health now." Micah didn't protest. 10-year-olds learn silence early when silence is safer. She opened the fridge, took out a plastic container, and set it on the countertop. A dull carrot and some plain boiled potatoes. Yesterday's leftovers, pared down to their least appealing form. Micah stared at them, but his stomach was tight, knotted. Hunger wouldn't even make noise yet. Ilara closed the fridge door with slow deliberation. She turned to him at last. "You are to stay in the kitchen and downstairs area. Do you understand?" Micah nodded. "Good. Less noise, less mess." The sentence was delivered without malice, but also without humanity. She walked upstairs then, heels tapping rhythmically on the wood, her phone in hand. Micah could hear her voice drift down, friendly, chatty, speaking to someone else in her carefully cultivated identity. He couldn't make out words, but he recognized tones, laughter, empathy, lightness. Micah shivered again. By late afternoon, the light outside changed to a gray-blue twilight, and the wind began to whisper against the window panes. In the kitchen, Micah remained in the corner, now curled forward slightly, hands tucked under arms. He'd been given a cup of water hours earlier, Nothing warm, nothing comforting. When Alara returned downstairs, her expression was perfectly composed, but her eyes registered Micah's posture like a security camera would register trespass. "You may sit at the table," she said. He obeyed, grateful for the elevation off the cold tile floor. She placed the container of potatoes and carrot before him. There were only a few small pieces. Micah waited for permission. "Eat," she said. He did. But as he chewed, he heard the wind outside rising. The storm wasn't here yet, but its voice was arriving early. The window rattled softly, like fingers tapping to be let in. He swallowed the last piece of potato. Alara watched him, not with concern, with assessment. She spoke almost casually. "No dessert, no hot chocolate." Micah nodded. The nod was small, but it was a language. "I won't challenge you. I don't want trouble." She took his empty plate and rinsed it with unnecessary force. The water hit porcelain like hail. Night came slowly, but inside the house the darkness was immediate, not from lack of light, but from how light was used. Alara turned off most of the downstairs lights, leaving only the overhead fixture in the kitchen glowing harshly, spotlighting Micah at the table like an exhibit. The living room, hallway, and stairwell remained dim or dark, turning the house into a quiet maze with cold breath. Micah rested his chin on his knees in the chair. His toes were numb. He counted his breaths. He missed the sound of Rowan's boots. He missed the warm weight of Braun's head on his lap. At around 9, Alara's footsteps returned to the kitchen. Micah looked up automatically, a reflex. Alara did not look angry. She looked precise. She set a glass of water in front of him, then reached for the back of his chair and pulled it, with him in it, a little closer to the center of the kitchen, positioning him where he was entirely visible from the doorway. It was a position of control, but Micah did something unexpected then. He asked a question, softly, barely. "Can I have a blanket?" Alara turned. Her face was unreadable. Then she shook her head. "You're fine." Micah lowered his eyes. The answer was the one he had expected, but hope is stubborn, even when small, even when tired. At last, Alara retired upstairs for the night. Micah was allowed into the living room then, not freely, but with boundaries. He curled onto the sofa, wrapping himself in one of the thin throws draped over the armrest. It helped, a little. He stared into the shadows. The house creaked with settling wood. He could hear the wind outside, clawing at the corners of the roof, swirling loose snow across the porch. Micah whispered, into the throw blanket, lips barely moving, "Braun." There was no answer, but in the boy's mind, he heard Braun's soft whine, the one from the car, the one that sounded like the last thread of connection between them. He clutched that imagined sound to his chest. Time passed in slow droplets. Micah didn't sleep much. At some point past midnight, he rose from the sofa and padded toward the hallway, careful not to make the floorboards creak. There was a small vent near the basement door, and through it, sometimes, a warmer draft of air would slip up from the furnace that serviced the lower level. He pressed his hands over the vent. Warmth, thin but real, seeped into his palms. His eyes closed. The warmth reminded him of Rowan, of Braun, of safety. But then he heard a step on the upstairs landing. Alara. She was awake. Micah returned to the sofa at once, lying back as if he'd never moved, breathing shallow. A pause. Then her voice drifted down the stairwell, not loud, but not soft. "Sleep." The command was simple and absolute. Micah didn't respond. He didn't move. Eventually, her footsteps retreated. The boy lay there, staring at the ceiling, the ache of cold and fear tucked into his ribs like stones. He didn't know when sleep finally came. All he knew was that when it did, it was thin and fragile, and it didn't keep the cold out. The storm had not yet arrived in full, but Winter Creek was already preparing itself. The sky wore a heavy quilt of gray, thick enough that even midday felt like twilight. Snow came in steady, silent veils, not the violent kind that whips sideways, but the kind that settles with patient inevitability, layer over layer, muffling sound and softening the edges of reality. Inside the temporary lodging assigned to the task force, Rowan stood at the window of his small room, one hand cupping a lukewarm mug of coffee, the other resting on the sill. Outside, he could see the trucks and patrol cars half buried in a fresh coating of white, their outlines blurring as if they were artifacts of some older, fading memory. The lodging itself, a rustic structure part motel, part municipal outpost, creaked occasionally as the wind pressed against it, seeking entry through unseen cracks. Rowan should have felt secure. The other officers were nearby, the heater hummed, and Braun lay in the corner on a warm mat. Yet there was something wrong inside his chest, something restless and wordless. Earlier in the task force briefing room, the others had made casual talk over paperwork and radio checks. They had spoken about the storm, about equipment logistics, about the boredom that came with waiting for criminal leads to break. Rowan had nodded at the right times, but the conversation felt like listening through fog. He couldn't quite hear the world clearly. He kept thinking of Micah's face at the door, pale, quiet, obedient, too obedient, and Braun blocking the porch. That growl, not a normal protest, not impatience, something more instinctive, the unease of an animal reading a threat humans refuse to see. Rowan turned his head slightly now and glanced at the dog. The German shepherd lay still, but not relaxed. His ears were halfway up, one twitching occasionally in response to sounds too subtle for human perception. His eyes were half-lidded, but always alert. Rowan had once joked that Braun slept with one ear in a different world. Tonight, there was no humor in the thought. Rowan set down the coffee and reached for his phone. Weak reception bars glowed in the corner of the screen. He tried a video call. It rang longer than usual before connection crackled to life, the image resolving first into metallic fuzz, then into the blurred outlines of a kitchen ceiling. Finally, Ilara's face appeared, framed carefully in the shot. "Rowan," she greeted with a bright warmth that felt staged. Just in time, we were getting ready for bed. "Can I see him?" Rowan asked. "Micah?" "Of course," she replied instantly, too instantly, then turned the phone. Micah came into view, wrapped in a blanket, sitting at the living room sofa. The camera was held at an angle that clipped most of his body from the frame. Rowan leaned forward unconsciously. "Hey, buddy?" Micah looked up. He attempted a smile, thin, brittle. "Hi, Dad." Rowan narrowed his eyes slightly. The boy didn't look flushed, didn't look feverish. "How are you feeling?" "A little tired," Micah replied softly. "Head hurts a bit." His voice was subdued, but that could be from many things: fatigue, cold, or something else. Rowan was about to ask more, about sleep, about meals, when Ilara's hand entered the frame, gently tugging the phone back. "We don't want him straining his eyes with screens," she said in that cooing tone. "Sleep is the best medicine." Rowan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, sure, just call me if anything changes." "Always," she said with a practiced smile. The call ended. Rowan stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Something didn't sit right. He replayed the glance of Micah's eyes, the tension in his small shoulders, the stiffness of the smile. His instincts, trained from years of tracking the difference between truth and cover, whispered, "Something is off." Behind him, Braun lifted his head, ears fully pricked now. The dog stared at Rowan, as if sensing the man's worry. Rowan spoke aloud, but softly. "You felt it too, didn't you?" Braun didn't bark. He just stared, solemn, attentive, waiting. Rowan paced the room. His boots scuffed against the floor. His breathing quickened. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Maybe I'm overcompensating because Sarah's gone. The thought struck him sharply. Sarah, Micah's biological mother, had died when the boy was 6. A sudden illness, unexpected, devastating. Rowan had held his son while the boy cried until his small body shook, and after that, Micah became quieter, gentler, more cautious with trust. Rowan had vowed to protect him always, but vows are easier to speak than to keep, especially when danger hides not in strangers, but in familiar faces. Rowan ran a hand over his eyes. "It's just 5 days," he muttered, "and tonight I can still call." But something in him murmured back, "Will you always be able to?" He tried to shake it off. He managed a few hours of paperwork, sorting through warrants and statements unrelated to Winter Creek. But late that night, while other officers drifted into their bunks, Rowan went outside with Braun onto the open porch that overlooked the snowy lot. The wind bit through his coat, but he barely felt it. He stared toward the direction of home, though he couldn't see it, couldn't sense it, except in his chest. Braun stood beside him, leaning slightly against Rowan's leg for warmth. Then, perhaps at the same moment, Rowan's thoughts reached their darkest point. The dog gave a sound. It wasn't a loud bark. It was a small, throaty whimper that carried an urgent tone, a warning, a plea. A memory of Micah's scent lingering on Rowan's jacket stirred in Braun's senses. Unwashed fear, suppressed distress. Rowan looked down sharply. "What is it?" Braun stared straight ahead. The wind howled. Snow spiraled. Rowan felt the echo of the whimper inside himself. He spoke quietly into the empty air. "We're going to check on him first thing tomorrow." But the storm answered that thought for him. A gust of wind that stung his face and drummed against the railing like a voice saying, "You don't have that kind of time." The next evening, with the storm now intensifying, Rowan tried another call. This time, Ilara answered with only audio. "Sorry, the camera, it's being weird," she said lightly. "Wi-Fi is shaky in the storm." "Let me hear Micah's voice." "He's already asleep," she said. Rowan's spine went cold. "Ilara, wake him." A pause. A too long pause. "He really needs his rest." Rowan didn't argue. His voice simply dropped to something low and iron-heavy. "Wake him." A rustle. Footsteps. Then small breathing on the line. "Dad?" Micah's voice was faint, hushed. "Hey, buddy." "I'm okay. Just tired." Something about the cadence was wrong. Too careful. Like each word was being weighed. Behind Micah's breathing, Rowan caught another sound. The creak of floorboards. Someone nearby. Listening. Then Ilara's voice interrupted, gentle but firm. "That's enough for tonight." The line cut. Rowan stared at the phone. Then he stood. Braun stood with him. The dog's hackles rose, not in aggression, but in understanding. Something was happening, something real, something dangerous. Rowan murmured, "If I'm wrong, I'll apologize. If I'm right, I won't be late." Outside, the storm roared louder, as if urging him onward, and far away, back at the house on the hill, a small boy curled under a thin blanket, trying not to shiver loud enough for anyone to hear, except maybe for one German shepherd who wasn't there, but still remembered him. And the distance between them felt like an abyss. But it would not remain that way for long. Rowan's instincts, the instincts of a father, were no longer quiet. They were rising like a howl in the wind. The storm finally arrived, not as a sudden fury, but as a slow and methodical conqueror, spreading layer upon layer across Winter Creek and the surrounding roads. By the fourth night of Rowan's absence, the wind had matured into a long, low moan, like an ancient thing pacing across rooftops. Snow was no longer falling in polite curtains, but sweeping horizontally across the world, scraping visibility down to inches. It was the kind of weather that made even seasoned highway crews pull over and wait for dawn. Inside the temporary lodging, the windows trembled under gusts, and the heater worked overtime. Rowan sat at the small desk, sleep nowhere near him, pencil tapping silently over a report he barely read. His mind was in two places at once, here in the outpost, and back home, where Micah lay somewhere in the dark. He stared at the clock. 8:54 p.m. Almost time to try another call. Behind him, Braun paced, slow, circular, restless. The dog didn't lie down anymore. Every few minutes he would stop, stand completely still, head tilted toward the door or toward Rowan's jacket hanging on the back of the chair, nose twitching. Scent memory, worry memory. Rowan finally pushed the paperwork aside and lifted his phone. No video today, he assumed, maybe not even audio. He tapped the app connected to his home's smart system, installed originally to keep the house safe after a break-in attempt 2 years prior. It had 2 internal cameras and 1 exterior-facing sensor. For weeks now, those cameras had been mostly incidental, capturing Micah playing with Lego on the living room carpet, or Ilara humming in the kitchen. Tonight, something different. A notification blinked on screen. Kitchen cam. Visual obscured. Audio intact. Rowan's eyebrows knit together. He opened the feed. The video frame was black, not corrupted, just blocked. Something, tape, cloth, had been placed over the lens. But the microphone was still active, and a jagged green waveform pulsed gently along the bottom of the screen. Rowan tapped the volume and leaned in. At first, only ambient sounds. The wind outside, the slight whine of the refrigerator, a soft metallic tap. Maybe a utensil against a plate. Then, footsteps, measured, unhurried, Ilara's. Her voice followed, no longer coded in hospitality. It was crisp, cold in tone, like frost cracking across glass. "You're not to go into the living room again without permission. Do you understand?" No response, then a small voice, barely audible. "Yes." "Micah?" Rowan froze. The timbre was wrong. The way Micah spoke, halting, careful, not like a child recovering from illness, but like a child calculating danger. Ilara continued, "And you will stay where I place you. I don't want to repeat myself." A soft sound then, not crying, not sobbing, something quieter, breathing broken by fear. Rowan's heart began to race. He didn't wait. He pulled up his direct line to dispatch. Unit 7 requesting immediate welfare check at private residence, 119 Cooper Hill, Winter Creek, possible child endangerment. The dispatcher answered calmly, "Acknowledged. However, be advised, storm conditions currently red flag. Nearest units are 12 and 19 miles out and will need to reroute due to closures on Tanner Road and Harbor Ridge." "How long?" Rowan demanded. Pause. Estimated arrival, 30 to 60 minutes, depending on visibility. 60 minutes. Rowan clenched his jaw. Back on the live audio. Micah spoke again, a little clearer. "I don't feel good. I'm cold." Ilara snapped back, voice sharp. "You're fine. Stop exaggerating. Children don't get to decide comfort. Adults do." Rowan's grip tightened on the phone until the casing creaked. He didn't notice Bron at his side now, eyes blazing, ears locked forward, because the dog heard it too. The next sound from the kitchen mic was the scrape of a chair, wood against tile. Ilara again, "You stay here. No wandering, no touching anything, no noise." Then footsteps, then a loud click, perhaps a switch or a latch. Then silence. Micah didn't speak again, but Rowan could hear his breathing, small, shivery, a child trying not to cry. The microphone translated breathing into peaks of green waveform, jagged, uneven. Bron whined, louder than before, a sound halfway between a plea and an alert. He pressed against Rowan's thigh. The storm raged harder outside, wind buffeting the building. Rowan stood abruptly. "Thanks for the update, dispatch," he said into the radio, voice barely controlled. "I'm also heading there now. We'll arrive ahead of backup." "Negative, Unit 7, the dispatcher countered quickly. "Roads are unsafe. You are not cleared to travel until—" But Rowan had already cut transmission. He grabbed his coat, his gloves. His breath came faster. A fellow officer, Morales, a middle-aged man with grizzled chin and calm eyes, stood in the doorway. "You go out in this, you're risking a ditch dive or a rollover," Morales warned. Rowan met his gaze. "My son's there," he said simply. Morales studied him for one heartbeat, then nodded once, deeply. "Understood." He stepped aside. Rowan and Bron headed for the exit. Outside, it was like stepping into another element entirely. The wind punched instead of pushed, snow sliced instead of fell. Rowan shielded his face, but kept moving. The SUV's headlights barely pierced more than 15 feet ahead. Rowan buckled in, Bron braced himself in back, and with a groan of tires, they pulled onto the road. The snow swallowed sound. Even the siren seemed quieter. The wipers struggled. The windshield blurred into ghostly streaks. Rowan drove anyway. Meanwhile, at the house on Cooper Hill, Micah, and sat on the same chair under the same hateful kitchen light. But the room felt different now. The storm's voice throbbed outside, and the cold seemed to press against window glass with deliberate force. It was as if the storm wanted inside, or wanted Micah out. He looked at the doorway, dark, silent. Then he gathered something small inside himself, a kernel of courage. He whispered, "Dad, please come home." He didn't know Rowan could hear him, but fate has curious ways. On the road, in the SUV, Rowan couldn't hear distinct words, but he heard something in the audio that was unmistakable. A child's heartbreak carried across static and distance, and Braun, who knew Micah's voice almost like Rowan did, whined again and pressed forward in the crate. As the SUV rumbled through the storm, Rowan whispered back, "Hold on, buddy, I'm coming." Even if Micah never heard the words, Braun felt the meaning, and between father, dog, and child, a fragile, invisible thread pulled tight. Tonight, Rowan's doubt had vanished. Tonight, instinct had become certainty. And Winter Creek, blanketed, wind-lashed, silent, stared down at a house where warmth had become punishment and light had become surveillance. But somewhere in the swirling dark, help was finally moving toward it. Driving through the storm felt like driving through a living thing. Snow hammered against the windshield in relentless waves, and gusts of wind shoved at the patrol SUV as though trying to push it off the road. Rowan leaned forward, hands taut on the wheel, eyes narrowed to slits. The headlights tunneled through the snow in a narrow cone of pale light, illuminating just enough to keep him from sliding into oblivion. Braun was standing now, not sitting, in the back compartment, head raised, body braced. Every few minutes he let out a low, vibrating sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, more like a pulse of urgency embodied. Rowan heard it each time and pressed the accelerator a little harder. Winter Creek's outer road was nearly invisible. The town looked like a ghost frozen in white. Houses were abstract shapes behind snow curtains. The street lamps glowed dimly under frost. When Rowan made the final turn up Cooper Hill, the snow was deeper. The tires threw chunks of it aside as they clawed for traction. His house came into view at last, dimly lit, roof buried under snow, and in the kitchen window, a single harsh light, glaring like an interrogation lamp. Inside that house, Micah. Rowan pulled up, killed the headlights, and for a moment sat in the silence. A deep, painful silence. Then he shut off the engine and stepped out. Instantly, wind punched him again. He shielded his face, trudging forward. Boots sank deep into accumulation. Each step felt like pushing through the resistance of a hostile world. He opened the back hatch for Braun. No command needed. The dog leaped out into the snow with the determination of a soldier crossing battlefield terrain. Rowan raised a hand, not to stop Braun, but to acknowledge him. Then man and dog approached the house, Braun slightly ahead, Rowan just behind him. Inside the kitchen, Ilara stood before the bound child again, posture rigid and breath shallow. The storm muffled exterior sounds, so she didn't hear the SUV approach. She didn't hear the boots in the snow. She didn't know anyone was there until Rowan's fist crashed against the back door. "Ilara!" The word was loud, not shouted wildly, but commanded with authority. Micah's head jerked upward. Ilara whirled toward the door, eyes wide, but only for a second. Then she steadied herself, and something flickered across her face. Anger, fear, defiance. She didn't answer. Rowan shouted again, "Open the door!" Silence, only wind, only storm, only breathing. Then, Rowan stepped back a half step, braced his shoulder, and slammed into the door with the force of a battering ram. The first hit splintered the frame. The second tore a crack through the reinforced glass. The third, the door gave way. It fractured with a sound like ice breaking on a lake, shards scattering onto tile and wood. Cold air poured inside. Braun was first through the threshold, sprinting with precision, barking once, loud and commanding. Not hysterical, not savage, just pure authority. Ilara flinched, stepping back, hands raising instinctively to shield herself. "Stay back!" she exclaimed, but her voice cracked. Braun didn't attack, but he planted himself between her and Micah, body poised, fangs bared only enough to signal consequence. Rowan strode into the kitchen, radio on his shoulder crackling with incoming transmissions from distant backup units. His eyes found Micah first, The boy was sitting rigid in the chair, wrists bound against the arms with fabric ties. His face was pale, eyes wide and shiny. But he was alive. Alive. Rowan was at his side in 3 long steps. His hands, rough hands, good hands, worked quickly at the knots. "It's okay. I'm here," he whispered, voice hoarse. Micah let out a tiny sound, part breath, part sob, like the dam of silence finally cracking. When Rowan pulled the last tie loose, Micah didn't hesitate. He threw himself forward into Rowan's chest, arms clutching desperately. "I knew you'd come," Micah gasped against his coat. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," Rowan said, voice thick with emotion he didn't often allow himself to show. Behind them, Bron held his stance. He didn't lunge or snap. He simply kept Alara at a distance. Anytime she shifted a step, he shifted too, eyes locked. Alara finally spoke, but her tone was not contrite. It was defensive, indignant. "I didn't hurt him. I was disciplining him. He was being ungrateful and—" "Stop!" Rowan's voice cut through her words like a blade. Her mouth snapped shut. Rowan stood now, Micah still hugging his waist. "You restrained him. You neglected him. You terrorized him. And you lied to his school and to me." Ilara's lips thinned. Her eyes darted to the shattered door, then to Bron, then back to Rowan. "You don't understand," she began. "No," Rowan said quietly. "I understand perfectly." Bron's snarl rumbled deeply, a warning to stay right where she was. Snow swirled through the broken doorway, carried by gusts. It dusted Rowan's boots, flecked Micah's hair, skittered across the kitchen tiles. The storm had come inside the house. Finally, sirens echoed faintly through the storm outside, then closer, then visible, flashing red and blue through the snow. Backup had arrived. 2 officers came into view through the doorway, faces stern beneath winter hats. Behind them, the ambulance's silhouette glowed in the whiteness. Alara raised her hand slowly. Whether in surrender or simply because she had no other option left, it was unclear. Rowan motioned to the officers. "Secure her." They did. No dramatics, no violence, just procedure. Ilara's voice turned into whimpers, then incredulous protests, then incoherent stringing of excuses. But Rowan didn't hear any of it. He had knelt back down. Micah had not let go, and Rowan had no intention of moving him. The boy's small body shook, but from relief now, not cold, or perhaps a mixture of both. Bron finally stepped away, sensing the danger was gone, and came to sit beside them, pressing his warmth against Micah's leg. Micah slid a hand into Bron's fur, grasping, grounding. "Good boy," he whispered. Bron let out a soft exhale, deep and satisfied. Outside, snow continued falling, but something had shifted. The storm no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a curtain closing on the dark act of the story. A new wind, a warmer one, seemed to stir beneath the frozen air. Inside the broken doorway, beneath the unrelenting winter, father and son stayed in their embrace. And in that moment, time did not exist. There was only the quiet truth of reunion, and the unwavering loyalty of a 4-legged guardian. The nightmare had ended, or at least the worst of it, and in its place something softer began. Fragile, but real. Winter Creek woke slowly the next morning, as if the town itself were sore from the storm. The snow had finally eased, leaving behind a stillness so complete that even the sparrows seemed hesitant to break it. Beneath a pale dawn sky, roofs lay thick with frost. Trees wore cloaks of powdered white, and the quiet streets seemed gentler, as though winter were trying to apologize for its severity. At the local clinic, sunlight filtered through narrow windows and laid a gold pale stripe across the checkered linoleum floor. Micah sat on a warm examination bed, wrapped in a soft thermal blanket, cheeks flushed with returning color. He rolled the edge of the blanket between his fingers, the way children do when both comforted and uncertain. Dr. Whitaker, a middle-aged woman with streaks of silver in her hair and a gentle firmness in her manner, stood nearby with a clipboard. She was one of those doctors who never changed their tone, whether delivering good news, bad news, or simple instructions. A steady, reassuring presence. She had been practicing in Winter Creek for 22 years, through blizzards, power outages, and flu seasons, and her experience made her calm seem almost sacred. She spoke in a warm cadence that didn't demand eye contact. "You're dehydrated, a little underfed, but nothing that rest and proper meals won't fix. The body is resilient, especially young ones." Micah nodded. He didn't fully understand the terminology, but he understood the tone. Rowan sat in a chair beside the bed. He looked exhausted, eyes ringed with fatigue, hair still damp from melted snow. But exhaustion wasn't the main thing visible on him. It was relief. The deep, unspoken relief that settles in a parent after surviving a threat to their child. He reached out and touched Micah's shoulder. Not possessively, not urgently, just a simple presence. "I'm here." Nearby, Braun lay curled on the floor, his thick coat forming a warm patch next to Micah's dangling feet. His eyes closed as he dozed lightly, but his ears twitched with every approaching footstep, every change in breathing, every shift in atmosphere. He was resting, not relaxing. There was a gentle knock on the doorframe. A young officer, Daniels, stepped in. Barely 25, with freckles still visible despite the cold, he looked hesitant as he cleared his throat. "Rowan, I thought you should know. They're transporting Alara now. She'll be taken to county holding for initial processing. Child Protective Services will be in touch with you later today. There will be paperwork, interviews, statements. I'm sorry, I know it's a lot." Rowan nodded slowly. "Thank you." Daniels hesitated. "For what it's worth, I've worked with Braun before. That dog probably saved a life last night. Maybe two." Braun lifted his head just enough to receive the compliment, then let out a soft exhale. Daniels smiled faintly. Then it excused himself. After he left, Dr. Whitaker turned to Rowan. "You're going to need to take some time, too," she said. "Not just him, you. Trauma is contagious, especially within families." Rowan didn't argue. He simply nodded in silent acknowledgement. Later that evening, the three of them, Rowan, Micah, and Braun, returned to their house. The broken back door had been temporarily boarded with plywood and heavy tape. It muffled the wind, but couldn't keep out all the cold. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of fear. But Rowan moved through it decisively. He flicked on warmer lights, turned on the heater, opened windows briefly to let in fresh air despite the cold, then closed everything again. Micah stood in the doorway, watching him. Rowan paused. "Do you want to stay in the kitchen right now?" he asked softly. Micah shook his head. "I don't like it in here anymore." Rowan considered the space, the harsh overhead lamp, the scarred back wall, the memory of the chair under unforgiving light. "Then you don't have to," he said. "Not tonight, not any night if you don't want to." They went to the living room instead. Rowan made cocoa, real cocoa, steaming and sweet, and handed the mug to Micah. The boy cupped it between both hands, drawing warmth into his palms, the way flowers draw light. Braun climbed onto the rug and positioned himself halfway between Micah and the front door, a loyal sentinel. Micah sipped the cocoa and looked up at his father. "Will I have to live somewhere else?" he asked. "No," Rowan answered instantly, firmly. "You live here, with me." Micah's shoulders relaxed. Rowan continued. "I might move to a different position at the department, something local, something that keeps me home more. Maybe training K-9 units instead of field assignments." Micah's eyes brightened. "So, you'd be here every night?" Rowan smiled gently. "That's the goal." Braun's tail thumped once on the rug. In the following weeks, Winter Creek thawed slowly. Not fully, winter still had its grip, but there was a subtle change. Sunlight stayed longer. Icicles dripped, snow softened. At the small park near the town center, Micah rode a little sled down a gentle hill. Laughter, real laughter, escaped him as he glided across the powdery surface. It wasn't loud laughter. Micah was still a quiet child. But it was joyful, ringing like a small bell carried on the wind. Braun ran alongside, not racing, escorting. Every time the sled slowed, Braun nudged it gently with his shoulder, urging it forward with teamwork. Rowan stood on the hilltop watching them, hands in coat pockets, a peacefulness settling into him like warmth inside a bone. Nearby, Mrs. Whitmore, an elderly neighbor who had long suspected something was wrong during Alara's care, waved from a bench. She was bundled in knitted layers and wearing luminous blue mittens. Rowan waved back. Gratitude passed between them, without words. Micah trudged back up the hill for another run, breath puffing in small clouds. He stopped beside Rowan and leaned briefly into his side. Silent affection. Rowan rested his hand on Micah's head, something he had always done, but this time it felt different. Not just loving, but anchoring. Bron sat nearby, panting softly, tongue out, eyes bright. His posture radiated something beyond training, almost like pride. That night, back at home, after dinner, pasta and broccoli and warm bread, Rowan sat beside Micah's bed. The boy was already tucked under a thick comforter. Bron lay just outside the bedroom door, body stretched across the threshold like a living guardrail against the past. Rowan read aloud from a worn book of winter tales, his voice low, steady, and Micah listened with eyelids growing heavy. When the boy finally drifted off, Rowan leaned down and whispered, "You're safe." Then he kissed Micah's forehead. As he stood, he glanced toward the doorway. Bron lifted an eye, just one, then closed it again, satisfied. Rowan turned off the light and paused one moment longer, letting the silence settle. Outside, the last remnants of storm wind softened to a hush, and inside, in that calm bedroom glow, a fragile peace began to calcify into something stronger. Trust renewed, hope restored, and a home reclaimed. It would take time, healing always does, but they had time now, together, through winter, and someday, into spring. In the quiet ending of this story, we are softly reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come through a father who refuses to ignore the voice of love, through a loyal dog whose instinct can sense fear where human eyes cannot see, and through the gentle strength that God places inside every heart that chooses to protect and to care. In our everyday lives, we all face storms of worry, uncertainty, or loneliness, but God walks beside us even then, guiding our steps, sending help in unexpected forms, and reminding us that no child, no parent, and no prayer is ever truly alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles God sends. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and warmth. And please remember to support the channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue bringing stories of hope, faith, and gentle redemption.